Okay, so today we're going to talk about the endocrine system, and I'm going to split the endocrine system up into two different videos. The first video is basically just an introduction to the endocrine system. We're going to talk about differences between the endocrine system and the nervous system. We're going to look at just all the organs in a general way, and we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms of hormones. So let's start out by looking at the differences between the endocrine system and the nervous system. So first of all, both of these systems use chemicals. So they both use chemicals as messengers. But the difference is when the nervous system uses chemicals, we call these chemicals neurotransmitters. And when the endocrine system uses chemicals, we call them hormones. But they're still chemicals. Now, both of them will use a lot of the same chemical messengers. So for instance, when the endocrine system uses norepinephrine and epinephrine, we'll call them hormones, but when the nervous system uses norepinephrine and epinephrine, we'll call them neurotransmitters. Both systems work on a negative feedback. So in the endocrine system, if the hormone level gets really high, then the glands that secrete that hormone will stop secreting it so that the hormone level doesn't get too high. Same thing with the nervous system as well. When neurotransmitter levels get too high, then negative feedback will cause those neurotransmitters to be secreted in lower amounts. Both of these systems also coordinate and regulate other cells and other tissues, organs, and other systems. So really, the endocrine system and the nervous system, those are the two systems of your body that run your entire body. They control your entire body. Now, some of the differences between the two, though, is the endocrine system. This regulates long-term metabolic activities. These long-term metabolic activities are things like growth. As a person grows and gets bigger, or in development. As a baby becomes a toddler and then becomes a child and then becomes an adolescent. And then also in reproduction. So the endocrine system is going to help to deal with all of these processes. In addition, the endocrine system is going to help with things like long-term stress. So we'll go through and we'll talk about those things as we go through the endocrine system. The nervous system, on the other hand, we've always said this is short-term. So this is a way to get away from dangers and to survive when there's any type of short-term crisis that comes up. Another difference here is what I've drawn. I want to show you this. So here we have the endocrine system above and the nervous system below. So in the endocrine system, we have these cells. So these are just endocrine cells. They could be part of any endocrine organ that you have or endocrine tissue that you have. So we see these cells. And in these cells are these little vesicles, and the vesicles contain these hormones. And so what happens is these hormones get released into the bloodstream. And once they're in the bloodstream, they will float down that bloodstream and they get pushed by the pressure from the heart until they finally get to their organ. So they get moved through the bloodstream, and then eventually they'll get to a target cell. And a target cell might be some type of organ in the body where the receptor is perfectly matched to the hormone. And once that hormone gets to that area in the blood, the hormone then will leave the blood and it'll bind then to that receptor. So it might travel quite a ways in the blood before it can actually find its receptor. The nervous system, on the other hand, and we've talked about this, the nervous system has these neurotransmitters in these little vesicles at the end of nerves. And so these vesicles that are filled with a neurotransmitter, calcium will come into the synaptic terminal and cause the exocytosis of these neurotransmitters out into the synaptic cleft. And then the neurotransmitter binds to the postsynaptic cell, and something will happen then. Either changes inside the cell or an ion will move into the cell. The distance from the presynaptic cell and the postsynaptic cell, that synaptic cleft where that neurotransmitter has to cross, it is very, very small. So the chemical only has to go a very short distance, and then it will only have a very short-term effect, because if this were like acetylcholine only lasts on that receptor for about 20 milliseconds. So it really doesn't last very long. However, when we're looking at the hormones, and the hormones are traveling, first of all, they have to travel a long way through the bloodstream in order to get to their target cell. And so they're going to last a lot longer, and they will bind to the receptors, but it's longer lasting. All right, so let's take a look at all of the different organs that we're talking about that are part of the endocrine system. So there are some organs that are primary endocrine organs. That means that is their job, is to be an endocrine organ. Their job is to secrete these hormones. So we'll take a look at the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus secretes ADH and oxytocin, and it also secretes regulatory hormones. So we're going to talk about the hypothalamus in this video. Then there's the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland has an anterior lobe and it has a posterior lobe. In the anterior lobe, there are hormones like the adrenocorticotropic hormone, the thyroid-stimulating hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and melanocyte-stimulating hormone. In the posterior pituitary, where we said the hypothalamus makes ADH and oxytocin, ADH and oxytocin will then be released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary. So we're going to look at that. Then there's the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland releases T3 and T4. T4 is known as thyroxine. It's an important and very common hormone that's talked about in healthcare. It also releases calcitonin. So we're going to talk about the functions of those. The adrenal gland is another primary endocrine organ. The adrenal gland has a medulla, which is inside, and it has a cortex, which is outside. So it's the outer layer. So the medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, and we already heard about this in the sympathetic nervous system. And the cortex releases cortisol, aldosterone, and androgens. 3 groups are released from the cortex. Another primary endocrine organ is the pancreas. The pancreas releases insulin and glucagon. Then we have the pineal gland, and we've heard about the pineal gland. It's in the diencephalon. It's in the epithalamus, which is part of the diencephalon, and it secretes melatonin. Then we also have the parathyroid glands, and their job is to release parathyroid hormone. So we have to go through each one of these organs, and we have to look at what the functions of each one of these hormones are. So today in our video, what we're going to do is go over the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Okay? And then we're going to leave everything else to another video. So we'll talk about all of these. And in addition to that, we're going to talk about organs that have secondary endocrine functions. And what that means is that these organs with secondary endocrine functions, their main job is not to release hormones. Instead, they have specific jobs, but they also secrete hormones. So for example, the heart. The heart's main job is to not secrete hormones. The main job of the heart is to pump blood. But in addition to pumping blood, it can release some hormones. It releases ANP and BNP, which are called natriuretic peptides, right? So its main job is to pump the blood, but as a secondary function, it will release natriuretic peptides. So we'll talk about that. Then there's the thymus. Its main job is to allow the T cells to mature, but it'll also release thymosin, which is a hormone. Adipose, its main job is to store fat, but it will release leptin. The GI tract, its main job is to digest food, for motility, to push food through the intestines, for absorption, but it also releases what we call enteroendocrine hormones, right? Gastrin is an example of that. Then there's the kidneys. And so the kidneys, their main job is to filter blood, but they also release erythropoietin and calcitriol. And then there's the gonads. And the gonads are testes in the male and ovaries in the female. The main job of the testes is to produce sperm, but they also release androgens like testosterone and inhibins. And ovaries, their main job is to produce the egg, or the oocyte, but they also produce hormones like estrogens, progesterones, and inhibin. All right, so this is an awful lot to go over. So we are going to look at, I'm going to star the ones we're going to look at. We're going to look at the thyroid gland and the adrenal gland and the pancreas, the pineal gland, the parathyroid gland, the heart, and the kidneys, and the gonads. We're going to leave these other things like thymus. We're going to lose that. We're going to leave that for the lymphatic system. Adipose, that's going to be left for the GI tract, as well as the enteroendocrine hormones will be left in the GI tract as well. So we have a little bit of work to do, but we can get it done. So we'll move on to the next slide. The next thing that I want to talk about with these hormones is that there are three classifications or three groups of hormones. We have one group that is derived from amino acids. So we say they're amino acid derived. This means that they actually are, they come from amino acids, and amino acids are very small. There's two particular amino acids. There's tyrosine, which is an amino acid, and there's tryptophan, which is an amino acid. So the hormones that are derived from tyrosine are the thyroid hormone and catecholamines. Catecholamines are epinephrine. So we heard of epinephrine as a neurotransmitter. Here, epinephrine is a hormone, and it's called a catecholamine. So those are the tyrosine-derived amino acid hormones. Then we have tryptophan-derived. Now, tryptophan comes from turkey, right? So you get tryptophan is the amino acid that's found in turkey. Well, melatonin comes from tryptophan. So melatonin is an amino acid derivative, and it comes from the amino acid tryptophan. The second group of hormones that we have are called peptide hormones. So if you remember what peptides are chains of amino acids. So peptide hormones are going to be bigger. So we have glycoproteins, and then we have some smaller proteins. And so we have glycoproteins. Some examples are thyroid-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, or follicle-stimulating hormone. All of these hormones come from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So that might be one way for you to remember the hormones that are peptide hormones, that are derived from peptides. Then we have small proteins like ADH and oxytocin. They each have their chains of 9 amino acids, so they're small proteins. You know, proteins can be 100 amino acids or more. ADH and oxytocin they're quite small. These hormones come from the posterior lobe of the pituitary. Then there's some other hormones, some other small protein hormones like insulin, that comes from the pancreas. And we have growth hormone, prolactin, And growth hormone and prolactin are going to come from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Plus, peptide hormones also include all of the hormones from the hypothalamus, the hormones from the heart, the hormones from the thymus, the GI tract, the pancreas, and the posterior pituitary. So we could basically say that hormones from the hypothalamus, from the anterior pituitary, or the anterior lobe of the pituitary if you want to write it out, and the posterior pituitary, or the posterior lobe of the pituitary if you want to write it all out, all of these hormones coming from there, they're all peptide hormones. So that helps to make it a little bit easier to remember. In addition, you have the heart and the thymus, which is the gland right above the heart, so those kind of linked together, plus the GI tract and the pancreas, which are very, very close together too. So there's ways to link these together to try to remember them. Finally, we end up with this last classification of hormones, and those are called lipid-derived or lipid derivatives. And so with lipid derivatives, we have eicosanoids and we have steroid hormones. Eicosanoids you're going to hear a lot in microbiology, and you're also going to hear about in advanced A&P. The three biggest groups under eicosanoids are leukotrienes, prostaglandins, and thromboxanes. Leukotrienes and prostaglandins are involved in the immune system. Leukotrienes, they're mostly immune system. Prostaglandin is involved with inflammation. And thromboxanes are involved in blood clotting. We'll get into that more in depth in advance. As far as steroid hormones go, the lipid derivative hormones, because steroid is a lipid, we have androgens, that's testosterone. Estrogen and progesterones, those are female hormones. And then we have calcitriol. So calcitriol is from the kidney, and it helps with calcium levels. So those are the three groups or classifications of hormones, and now we want to look at what happens to hormones once they are released. All right, so let's say that we have one of those endocrine cells, and so maybe it's the pancreas or maybe it's the thyroid, but it's some type of cell, and that cell releases the hormone. So then that hormone that gets released from that endocrine gland goes into the blood. Once it's in the blood, one of two things is going to happen. It's either going to be floating around free, and if it's floating around free, we say it's unbound because it's not bound to anything, and then it will really only be functional for about 2 minutes to 1 hour, so it really doesn't have a long life. However, it could bind to a transport protein. An example of a transport protein would be something like albumin or globulin. Those are a couple of the plasma proteins. And so if they bind to that hormone, now the hormone has a better chance in the blood. If it's unbound, there's too many enzymes in the blood that'll break it down. So if it is bound, it can be carried through the blood and transported through the blood until possibly it gets to its target organ. So let's look at what the fate of the hormone is going to be. So first of all, as it's traveling through the blood, it might end up going through the liver because blood goes through the liver. And as it goes through the liver, it might leave the blood and get absorbed by the liver cells. Or it might, if it goes through the kidney, it might leave the blood and be absorbed by the kidney cells, in which case it's going to be broken down, right? So they will be broken down by the liver or the kidney, and in either case, then that hormone will be excreted out of the body. So that's one fate. Another fate is if it's unbound, it'll be broken down in the blood by enzymes. So that's another fate. So two very tragic fates. But the third thing that might happen is that it can diffuse out of the blood and then it can bind to a target cell. So here we have a picture. We can see that here's that hormone. It's diffusing out of the blood and it has found its target cell. So what do I mean by a target cell? So the hormone here is kind of like a key, and it only fits into certain locks. So if it finds its correct lock, it will fit right into that. So it fits like a lock and key. Now that means that there's only very specific areas that hormone can actually bind to, because we know that not every key can fit into every lock. Now, once that hormone binds to its receptor, then a couple of things can happen to the target cell. And so we're going to look at the effects of the hormone as it binds to the target cell. One thing it can do is it can alter genetic activity. So it can make the cell start functioning in certain ways. Maybe it'll stimulate the cell to do something, or maybe it will inhibit the cell so it doesn't do something. But anyway, it can alter that genetic activity. The other thing that can happen is that hormone could also alter the rate of protein synthesis. So for example, if that hormone were testosterone, and testosterone bound to the receptor, then testosterone can make the cell go through transcription and translation and produce more proteins. So during transcription and translation, proteins are being produced, so we're getting additional proteins being produced. So what do we know about testosterone? Like a steroid hormone, right? Steroid hormones build muscle mass. So that's an example here. When testosterone binds to its receptor, it'll make muscle cells produce more proteins, making that muscle hypertrophy and get bigger. Another thing might happen is that the hormone, once it binds to its receptor, could change the membrane's permeability to another molecule. So let's take for an example the hormone insulin. So if insulin binds to a receptor on a cell, it can actually open the gate for glucose. So then glucose, which is a molecule outside the cell, can then enter into the cell because insulin has opened the gate. So that's what I mean by it changes the membrane permeability. It just increased the permeability to glucose. So the effects on the target cell can be both direct and indirect. If the effect is direct, it means that the hormone binds to the receptor, which is a gate. The gate opens up, and that allows a molecule that's outside the cell to then enter the cell. So it's really kind of a direct effect. Pretty simple. Hormone binds, gate opens up, molecule comes in. An indirect way that a hormone affects a cell will use a second messenger. So in this example, there's not a gate. Instead, here we have a receptor on the target cell, and the hormone binds to it, but there's no gate there. So instead, what happens is that on the inside of the cell, attached to that receptor, is a second messenger. And that second messenger can cause a change inside the cell, which will either accelerate activity or will inhibit activity. So I'm just showing an example here where this second messenger, once it's activated, will change AMP to cyclic AMP, and that accelerates the cell. Or if we had the opposite effect, Here's a receptor, and here's the hormone binding to it. In this case, it does the exact opposite. It turns cyclic AMP into AMP, and that inhibits the activity of that cell. So basically what I want you to know is that an indirect effect doesn't open an ion channel. Instead, it activates a second messenger inside the cell, and the second messenger then will either accelerate activity or inhibit activity. Okay, then let's move on to the last things that I want to talk about in this first video, and that's talking about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So let's take a look at what we have here. I have this all kind of drawn out. So we have this right here. Everything above this is the hypothalamus. Then we have this, this kind of like this stalk right there. And that stalk there connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. This is called the infundibulum. Okay. Then we have the pituitary gland. So here's the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland can be divided up into two lobes, two main lobes, but there's three sections there. So there's one section on the front here that's called the anterior lobe. So there's the anterior lobe right there. And then there's a little tiny sliver of tissue in the middle, which is called the intermediate lobe, or the pars intermedia. And then on the other side, there's another lobe that we call the posterior lobe. So we have three different lobes here, right? So we're going to talk about the hormones from each lobe, and we're going to talk about these separately because they all do separate things. So let's first talk about the hypothalamus's three functions with the endocrine system that I want to discuss. So the first thing is that the hypothalamus secretes regulatory hormones. Now, what that means is that the hormones that the hypothalamus secretes will regulate the hormones that the anterior lobe of the pituitary will release. Okay? So what that means is that there's these hormones like TRH, CRH, GnRH, PRH and PIH, GHRH and GHIH. So let's look at the names. First of all, when you say RH, that stands for releasing hormones. That's a releasing hormone. So whenever you see RH, you know that hormone is coming from the hypothalamus. The IH, there's a couple of IHs there. Those hormones, when you see IH, that means it's an inhibitory hormone, but it's still coming from the hypothalamus. So RH and IH come from the hypothalamus. All right, so let's look at these individually. First, we have the hormone TRH. That means thyroid releasing hormone. So that gives us a clue. First of all, RH tells us it's coming from the hypothalamus. Thyroid tells us that it has something to do with the thyroid. Well, when TRH, which is a regulatory hormone, gets released, it will travel down to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. How does it get there? Well, there are these capillaries here, which are called the hypophyseal portal capillaries, or portal system. They're just little capillaries. They're like, they're portal. They go from one port to the other. So these little capillaries go from the hypothalamus to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. They're not going to go out into your general circulation. They just have a very short distance to go, so they have a very specific route through these portal capillaries. All right, so TRH, thyroid releasing hormone, goes through these little tiny capillaries all the way down to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And in the anterior lobe of the pituitary, it stimulates these certain cells in the anterior pituitary to release TSH. TSH. So TSH is also what we call a tropic hormone. It's going to go somewhere else and it is going to stimulate that organ to release even more hormones. So TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. TSH gets released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary and it gets into the bloodstream. Now, this is your general circulation, and TSH will go all the way to the thyroid, and it'll bind to the thyroid and cause the thyroid to release T3 and T4. T4 is thyroxine. We're going to learn tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but we're going to learn in our next video what the thyroid hormones actually do. Right, what I want to do here is show you this cascading sequence of events that have to happen in order for the thyroid to release T3 and T4. So there's a lot of regulation going on here. It's not like one person has control. We've got TRH getting released from the hypothalamus, causing TSH to be released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary, which finally makes its way to the thyroid so that the thyroid can release the thyroid hormones. There's a lot of regulation going on there. Next, let's look at CRH. This is also a hormone from the hypothalamus. It stands for corticotropic releasing hormone. So corticotropic. Tropic just means it's going to make another gland or another organ secrete more hormones. But cortico tells us that it has something to do with the adrenal cortex. All right, so let's see what happens. So the hypothalamus releases CRH. CRH, again, is going to travel through that little hypophyseal portal system, through those little capillaries, all the way down to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. In the anterior lobe of the pituitary, it will cause the cells in the anterior lobe to release ACTH. ACTH stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. Again, the name is giving it away. This hormone is going to contact, its target cell will be the adrenal cortex. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. So the CRH from the hypothalamus causes ACTH to be released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. ACTH then leaves and enters into the blood. Okay, now it's in the blood and it'll travel to the adrenal cortex because that's its target. Okay, then it'll cause the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids. So in our next video, we'll talk about what glucocorticoids do. We'll talk about the adrenal cortex and we'll talk about the glucocorticoids. But here, I just want you to understand that waterfall effect, that regulatory effect, where CRH from the hypothalamus causes ACTH to be released from the anterior pituitary, which causes the adrenal cortex then to release the glucocorticoids. It's a regulatory system. Then let's go to the next hormone. The next hormone we want to talk about in the hypothalamus is GnRH. GnRH stands for gonadotropic releasing hormone, right? RH tells us it's from the hypothalamus. So gonadotropic means it has something to do with the gonads. What are the gonads? The gonads are the testes in the male and the ovaries in the female. So this gonadotropic releasing hormone gets released from that hypothalamus, and it travels down through those little hypophyseal portal capillaries down to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Now, in the anterior pituitary, it'll cause some cells to release FSH and some cells to release LH. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. LH stands for luteinizing hormone. All right, so they're going to get released. They get released and they go to the same place. They're going to go to the testes in the male and the ovaries in the female. So both of these get released and they end up in the blood, and then the blood is going to carry them to the testes if it's a male and to the ovaries if it's a female. If it is the male, then these hormones, there's a couple of, they're going to, like in the male, they're going to produce sperm, and they're also going to release the hormone testosterone. In the female, they're going to help the female produce the egg, and they're also going to release the hormones estrogens as well as progesterones. Again, I'm going to talk about all of these final organs, endocrine organs and glands in our next video. Right now, I want you to get this flow. I want you to memorize the hypothalamic hormone and what hormone it causes to be released in the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and then what organ does it actually target. Okay, so now we're going to look at the next hypothalamic hormone. This is PRH and PIH, and we're going to talk about these two things together. One of them is a releasing hormone, one of them is an inhibitory hormone. So RH is releasing, IH is inhibitory. The P stands for prolactin. So PRH travels through those little capillaries down to the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and they cause the cells of the anterior pituitary to release prolactin. Prolactin then goes right to the mammary glands in the female that is breastfeeding, that's just had a baby, and causes those mammary glands to release milk. So it doesn't cause the mammary glands to release another hormone, which is what we have been seeing. Instead, it just causes the mammary glands to release milk. Now, if the other one were released from the hypothalamus, if it were the prolactin inhibitory hormone that's released, that will also target the anterior lobe of the pituitary, but in that case, because it's inhibitory, it will stop the anterior pituitary from releasing prolactin, so the mammary glands then will not produce milk. So PIH and PRH, they both affect the anterior pituitary. One will cause prolactin to be secreted. The other one will inhibit prolactin from being secreted. Then finally, we get to our last hypothalamic hormones, which are called GHIH and GHRH. Again, any releasing hormone or inhibitory hormone comes from the hypothalamus. So let's look at these. GH stands for growth hormone. So when growth hormone releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus and targets the cells in the anterior pituitary, and again it gets there through those little hypophyseal portal capillaries, the anterior pituitary will then release growth hormone. When growth hormone is released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary, it will target things like the liver. And then the liver will secrete a hormone called somatomedins, right? Somatomedins. So we'll talk more about that again a little later on. in the next video. I really just want you to see this regulatory system. Then we also have that growth hormone inhibitory hormone. So when that's released, GHIH, when that's released from the hypothalamus, it will target the cells in the anterior pituitary and it will stop growth hormone from being released from the anterior pituitary. So then that's it for our regulatory hormones. So what do you have to remember? You have to remember what are the hormones that come from the hypothalamus and what do they cause the anterior lobe of the pituitary to do? And when these hormones from the anterior lobe of the pituitary get released, where do they target? And at their target cells, what do they cause those target cells to release or to do? So in all of these cases, the hormones from the anterior lobe of the pituitary cause their target glands like thyroid, adrenal cortex, testes and ovaries. They cause them to release more hormones. So we say they're tropic because they released more hormones. But in the case of like prolactin, it goes to the mammary glands and just makes the mammary glands secrete milk. It didn't secrete a hormone, it just secreted milk. All right, now let's talk about that middle lobe, which is called the pars intermedia. This is kind of a simple one. The pars intermedia releases one hormone. That hormone is called melanocyte stimulating hormone. So melanocyte stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the melanocytes. Do you remember what the melanocytes do? Mostly what we know about the melanocytes is that they produce melanin, which is a pigment which makes the skin darker. So we know that sometimes if a person has a big tumor in the pituitary gland, a person will look like they have a suntan even though they've never even been out in the sun, just because it stimulates this intermediate lobe to produce additional melanocyte stimulating hormone, which stimulates those melanocytes to produce melanin, making a person look like they have a suntan when actually they haven't been outside at all. There's some other functions that we think might be happening with this melanin, but we're really not sure, like the timing of reproduction and other things like that. So we're not going to go too much further into that. Just know that the melanocyte stimulating hormone comes from the intermediate lobe of the pituitary. And then finally, we have the posterior lobe of the pituitary. So the posterior lobe of the pituitary produces two hormones. One hormone is called ADH and the other hormone is called oxytocin. ADH you will hear again and again and again and again, and it's a very important hormone for you to learn. So ADH here we have drawn in these little red circles here. ADH is produced in the hypothalamus, and then it's transported through the axons of neurons down into the posterior lobe of the pituitary. So it gets stored in the ends of those axons in the posterior lobe of the pituitary until it's stimulated to be released. So an antidiuretic hormone, what ADH does, is it causes you antidiuretic. It makes you retain water. Antidiuretic. So if your blood volume starts to go down or you start to get dehydrated, then this ADH gets secreted, and it gets produced in the hypothalamus, and it travels down and it gets stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary. So when you're real dehydrated and you need more water, then ADH gets secreted out of the posterior lobe of the pituitary, and it causes you to retain water at the kidneys. So when ADH gets secreted, so here's the ADH hormone, got released from that neuron, went out into the blood. It'll travel through the blood and it'll get to the kidneys, and it'll make the kidneys retain the water instead of urinating it out, right? So that way you retain more water and now you're less dehydrated. A couple of keys here. First of all, it's not traveling through the hypophyseal portal capillaries. It's actually traveling through a neuron to get from the hypothalamus to the posterior lobe of the pituitary. All right, so what does ADH do? ADH causes you to retain water. Now, the other hormone that's produced in the hypothalamus by these neurons are called, that's oxytocin, or OXT, right? So oxytocin also will travel through that axon, okay, down into the synaptic terminal, and it sits there until it's ready to get released. And when oxytocin gets released, then it will go out into the blood, and oxytocin is going to go to the mammary glands. And at the mammary glands, it will cause milk ejection. So looking at the mammary glands, we know that prolactin caused the mammary glands to produce milk. And now we know that oxytocin causes the mammary glands to release the milk so that the baby can actually drink the milk. So finally, we have one more thing that the hypothalamus does. The hypothalamus is the sympathetic control center to the adrenal medulla. So when the hypothalamus gets stimulated and you're in a fight or flight situation, then a neuron from the hypothalamus will send a message all the way down to the spinal cord and synapse onto a preganglionic neuron. And that preganglionic neuron will exit somewhere between T1 and L2 and will go all the way out to the adrenal medulla and will cause the adrenal medulla to release both norepinephrine and epinephrine, and you'll get a sympathetic response. What that means is that you're going to get that fight or flight response. Because we said the hypothalamus was the control center for the sympathetic nervous system, and so this is how. It will send a message down to the preganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron will go all the way out to the adrenal medulla, cause the adrenal medulla to release those norepinephrine and epinephrine hormones that will go to all the organs of the sympathetic nervous system and cause that sympathetic activation. Your heart will beat faster, your lungs will breathe faster, your airways will dilate, your pupils will dilate, your digestive system shuts down, your urinary system shuts down. So you get all those effects of the sympathetic nervous system. So if we go back and we look at this and we try to say, okay, what did I learn? There's so much here. Number one, the hypothalamus secreted regulatory hormones. These are the regulatory hormones that were secreted by the hypothalamus. They caused other hormones to be released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. These are the hormones that were released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. You need to know which hypothalamic hormone caused those to be released. Then those hormones of the anterior lobe of the pituitary, they went to their target organs. So here are the target organs. You need to know which of those hormones targeted which gland or organ, right? Then you need to know those target organs, what was the hormone or the effect on those targets. Okay, number one. Then number two, what we did was we looked at the fact that the hypothalamus produces ADH and oxytocin. And so we said that ADH and oxytocin aren't going to travel down to the pituitary through blood. Instead, they travel down to the posterior lobe of the pituitary through a neuron. And again, they're going to the posterior lobe of the pituitary, not the anterior lobe. We said that ADH then gets released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary. It's going to go to the kidneys, and it's going to help the kidneys retain water, right? We also talked about oxytocin, and we said that oxytocin gets released. It's made in the hypothalamus, just like ADH was made in the hypothalamus, but then it gets released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary, and it targets the mammary glands in the breasts, and it causes the milk to be ejected so that the mom can nurse and the baby can nurse. Mom can breastfeed, baby can nurse. The last thing we talked about with the hypothalamus is that we said it is the control center for sympathetic nervous system. So when the hypothalamus gets triggered that there is a fight or flight situation, a neuron will go all the way down the spinal cord. It'll synapse onto the preganglionic neuron. That preganglionic neuron extends to the adrenal medulla, and the adrenal medulla will release norepinephrine and epinephrine, which travels to all those organs of the sympathetic nervous system, and we get sympathetic activation. All right, so then this ends the first video that I have on the endocrine system. The second video that I have will target very specific glands and organs in your body, and we'll discuss what hormones are released from them, and then what do those hormones do? What are the effects of those hormones? So this whole first video was basically an introduction to the nervous system, looking at some of the ways that the hormones are regulated by the hypothalamus, and looking at tropic hormones from the pituitary gland. So I'll see you in the next video.